Hi, and welcome to Myth Informed. I'm your host, Brian Edward, along with me, Jake.
Hello, hello.
Part of the Myth Informed team. And today we are talking to Emily Molli, who's one of the founders and reporters of Subverse, which is an independent, no-spin news network, and trying to get to the heart of the matter, where they're putting truth over bias, is what I'm looking at. That some people feels like the adversarial process is more important than getting at the truth. And there's something to be said for the adversarial process, but there's something to be said for putting truth in reporting above what you want to see. So welcome, Emily. Did I categorize like the aims of Subverse there? That's my kind of take, but what I would like your take.
Yeah, no, I think you hit it pretty well there. There's a lot of people who still kind of want journalism that isn't supposed to, it's not trying to tell you what to think. It's just giving you information so you can make up your mind. And so that's kind of what we're trying to do.
That's good.
With everything, covering things, doing a lot of raw footage and basic contextualizing and not too much agenda. No agenda driving, just letting people figure it out.
Sure. And it sounds like raw is a good descriptor for where you've been lately. So right now you're in Paris, where you were covering the yellow vest, but you got back to, and what we wanted to focus on was Hong Kong. So you went over to Hong Kong to take a look at the Hong Kong protests, which have made a lot of news, both from the NBA and just in general, and we'll kind of hit those things one at a time. But so you head over to Hong Kong, and could you just give us some background? I think some people sometimes are confused on what isn't Hong Kong part of China? Like, what's some of the history? What's a quick background?
Okay, so a quick background. Hong Kong is a special administrative region of China. They were a British colony until 1997, and then they had an agreement to return to China in a little over 20 years, I believe now, or around 20 years from now. I can't remember the exact year they're supposed to go back, but the idea is that they're supposed to be under the one country, two systems idea, which is they have autonomy, they have their own leader, and they have their own laws that, in China, you have things like Twitter, Facebook, YouTube banned. You can get all of those things in Hong Kong, though. So there's sort of been the sentiment from a lot of people in Hong Kong that Beijing and the Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese government, has been sort of encroaching more and more on Hong Kong's freedoms and their rights. And this kind of came to a head when there was this extradition bill that was proposed. And so there's been over years these issues with disappearances and, for example, there were those authors who were kind of disappeared, ended up in the news. And so they expected this extradition bill to kind of legalize those disappearances and people. It was supposed to be put into place after this guy murdered his girlfriend, and then they wanted to extradite him from Taiwan back to China. However, people kind of saw this as a thinly veiled attempt to make it possible to extradite people from Hong Kong to China. And so it sparked these huge protests that started with just the want to remove the bill, totally withdraw it, and kill it. However, they waited a really long time. They just recently, in the last week, formally withdrew the bill, but it's been going on for months now. And so now they have 5 demands. Withdrawing the extradition bill was one of them, but now they want independent investigation into the police. They want, so they had withdraw the bill, investigate the police. They basically want more autonomy in their region, because even right now, like the leaders that they do have are chosen by the Chinese government for them to elect. So they don't really feel like they have a democratic process. And so this has turned in from an anti-extradition protest into a pro-democracy protest. So it's fascinating to me because this is one of the most, there's kind of the most organized protests that I've ever seen. They organize through Telegram, they organize through social media, and it's been really fascinating to watch just how well they come together and how unified they are. And it's pretty much unlike anything that I've seen in any other other countries' protests or social movements. So I love it, and I can't wait to go back. And I really, really think people in America should be paying attention to it, and not just because it shows up when an NBA player makes a comment about it.
Yeah.
No, yeah, I think I found it pretty interesting too. I mean, I kind of get what you're saying, whereas something unlike anything else. I know, I can't remember what year it was, but it was back when I was in college, just to date myself here, when the umbrella protests were going on. That was kind of something that captured my attention a lot. Mm-hmm. And it kind of, I guess, maybe kind of just fell out of the news, or maybe I kind of just fell off it, but it seemed to kind of just go away over time, or maybe become less of a newsworthy issue. But then here we are seeing these protests pop up again, and definitely it seems like in a lot bigger force. I guess I do understand what the Hong Kongers or the Hong Kongese plight here and their fight for democracy, but in the long term, I guess, what is their goal? If they're eventually going to be absorbed back into China, what are they, I guess, I don't know, like what's a win for them look like?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people mistake this movement as a pro-independence movement, but it's really not. There's this very small selection of the protesters who want independence, but for the most part, they just want their own democratic process. They want their autonomy to be preserved. So I don't really know what the end game is going to be. I think they need to have some concessions from China to kind of take their hands out of their processes in order for them to be satisfied. I mean, the way that they're handling things with the protests right now is very similar to the 2014 umbrella movement, where they've been using a lot of force. However, this time it's way more force than they used in the umbrella movement. So I think it's going to be hard to put the genie back in the bottle at this point with these ones, because the umbrella movement was much more peaceful on the side of the protesters. This one, there's kind of been one thing that sticks with me is just them talking about how riot is the method of the unheard, and they tried the peaceful protest before, and look what happened. It got quashed pretty easily. And so now they say that this is the only way, fighting back is the only way that they can really get what they want. So that's kind of their perspective coming at it. Some of the tactics they're using, which are pretty interesting to me, because in a lot of protests in the US or in other Western European countries, you see a lot of people setting businesses on fire, setting things on fire in general. It's very targeted in Hong Kong. They'll mostly destroy shops and businesses that are linked to mainland China or linked to individuals or companies who have voiced disapproval or no support for the protests. So it's a lot more calculated than anything I've seen before.
Interesting.
Yeah, it is. It kind of reminds me when you say riot is the method of the unheard. I mean, it sounds like something like an Antifa protester might say. It's interesting, and I heard one. I was talking to a guy and who I think is on the far left, and he might even describe himself that way too, but was saying that like the Antifa attack on the ICE facility was just a destruction of infrastructure, that there was no intent to hurt anybody, and that this is the method, that this is kind of justified if you believe that piece. So it really depends. Like these kind of tactics depend on the justification. Like is the grievance enough to justify riot?
That's interesting. I have a hard time equating Antifa, and I'm sure Antifa would love to equate themselves with the Hong Kong protesters, but they're totally different breeds from what I can see. And I mean, even Antifa within different countries are different breeds. I feel like American Antifa are their own sort of their own category. They do share some similarities with European Antifa, but yeah, I'm sure they do probably want to co-opt a lot of the messaging. And I have actually seen a lot of American anti-fascist activists trying to jump on the Hong Kong bandwagon. And there's been some protests where they even try to use umbrellas. But specifically, there's been a lot of activists who are trying to almost inform Hong Kong activists what media to trust. And I don't know if it's going so well, because one of the other interesting things about this one is Even just recently, Mike Pence voiced his support for the Hong Kong protests. And I know Nancy Pelosi has as well, but I've been seeing a lot more politicians on the right in the US voice their support for the Hong Kong protesters. And so I'm sure there's a lot of like trying to grab that movement. And, you know, in Hong Kong, they do wave a lot of American flags. They do have a lot of American-centric, I don't want to call it propaganda, but
imagery,
public relations.
Yeah, themes and imagery.
Yeah. So it's really interesting that they would do that, and I just hope Americans can see the difference, because even though they are all wearing black and wearing masks, they have a lot more legitimate reason to hide their identity and use black bloc tactics than American Antifa do, honestly.
The biggest difference that I see is that the Hong Kong protest is not specifically anti-capitalist, right? That I don't think that that's
almost
part
the
of
opposite.
it, right? And that Antifa, like it seems much of what they do is anti-capitalist, even if it's something about Black Lives Matter and somebody's been shot by the police and they're protesting, or if it's ICE and immigration and things like that. All of this has an anti-capitalist base, and
oh, sure.
Even like attacking the infrastructure is attacking the infrastructure of capitalism. So in that way, they're wholly different.
Right, but I guess I could see them both being the same, as they're both attacking kind of the structure there within themselves. Like, we are in a capitalist structure, so Antifa, to rebel against the structure, will be inherently anti-capitalist. It's not going to be the same thing when you're in Hong Kong, because they don't have a capitalist structure in China.
Right. In fact,
I think I have seen a little bit of very small amount of anti-capitalist sentiment in Hong Kong. However, I don't think that would be an overarching theme there. I do think in Hong Kong you do have a lot of runaway capitalism. If you look at the wealth inequality there, and like the housing crisis and the unemployment crisis and just the industries in Hong Kong in general, it's a lot of Western finance. And if you want to live in Hong Kong, you basically have to have a very, very well-paying job, at least in order to afford a comfortable lifestyle there. And even that comfortable is based on how you define your comfort.
Mm-hmm. Emily, I was kind of curious. Something I haven't really been able to gather from what I've looked into about the Hong Kong protests is Hong Kong itself is just a city, correct? It's one city?
Well, it's more of a region. So it's you have like the main city parts of Hong Kong, which are the lower, kind of the lower parts. You have Kowloon, and then you have Hong Kong Island, which are kind of the more central city areas. But the further north you go, you have the New Territories. You have like Tai Po and a lot more natural, like forestry and houses, and less skyscrapers and stuff. But
gotcha.
A lot of it is pretty urban.
Okay, so I guess when these protests are happening, are they shutting down like large portions of Hong Kong itself, or is it localized? I mean, I guess we only ever see footage of the protests themselves, so it gives you kind of a biased perspective of how big they are, probably. But
I would say like the biggest actions tend to happen in the city itself, but it has become really decentralized. There are a lot of actions that kind of pop up almost like flash mobs, where it's all over the place. Because one of the things that they do, if they think there's going to be a large protest or a large gathering in the city, in like any specific part of the city, they'll close down the MTR, the metro, and when they do that, then people will just kind of have these pop-up protests wherever they can. And a lot of times it'll happen at malls or at MTR stations, because the MTR stations themselves are catching a lot of flack for basically acting like police stations, police staging areas, and transporting police. So there's a lot of anti-MTR
What's
amongst
MTR
the protesters.
Mean again? MTR. What's that mean again?
It's the mass transit railway there.
Okay.
It's like our subways and yeah.
And there was a major protest at the airport once as well.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems like protesting at places where communication, especially in a big city, transportation is huge. Like this is a bee sting, right?
Yeah,
this gets noticed.
Yeah, the airport specifically was interesting because that was a way for them to try to reach a more international audience. Mm-hmm. The airport is extremely important for Hong Kong. It's the tourism in Hong Kong the tourism was pretty high in Hong Kong. They actually decimated a lot of the tourism. It's funny because each time I flew over there, I basically had an empty plane. It was kind of wild. But I think they're learning not to. The big airport protest they did was very impactful. When they tried it again, they closed down a lot of the transportation to the airport, and I think they realized it was probably not the best logistical place to protest because the airport itself is on another island. So there's very few points to get on and off. And it was easy for the police to nab people going in and out of those protests. So yeah, it is a good tactic on their part to use the transportation, but the police have kind of caught on. And that's why on the big days of demonstration, they will basically cut off the service between certain times or even for an entire day.
No, that's something else. What does China want? I mean, I think this is hard to guess at, but people look at, say, Tibet, and that they want a full annexation. I mean, is that certainly the fear of the protesters?
Yeah, I mean, I would say so. They look at places like Xinjiang, which is East Turkestan, and what happened to all the Uyghurs who are either allegedly being forced to marry Han Chinese or being put into re-education, basically concentration camps. There's a lot of horror stories coming out of the Xinjiang province, which is driving a lot of the fear in Hong Kong. And I think because there was this one point where there was the San Ukling holding center that they were sending a lot of the arrested protesters to, where it was this really remote prison that had been defunct for years. And people would come out of there with serious injuries, with absolute horror stories of like all kinds of sexual abuse and torture. And, obviously it's very hard to corroborate those kinds of claims if you don't have any eyes or ears on the inside other than the protesters themselves and then the police who are pretty tight-lipped as it is. So, yeah, I think there's China. The guess is that they want to. I mean, basically, Hong Kong was the economic gate to China, and now they're using Shenzhen as kind of the next best thing in China. But I think they do see the immense power and wealth that is in Hong Kong, and who wouldn't want that if you're a growing nation? And yeah, so I'm sure they're trying to put themselves in a spot where when Hong Kong does eventually go back to them, they could take full advantage of it. Interesting.
So yeah, and the Uyghurs, the
Uyghur?
The Uyghurs, yeah. So that's a Muslim population, I think, in Western China, right?
Yeah,
and
yeah, that's right.
To me, it seems what I've heard is there's a cultural Chinese affect that you have to have, and what they told the Uyghurs that you can't name your kids Muhammad anymore, that that we're not going to allow this, that they want this kind of cultural control. A little bit. It sounds like it's almost like the Borg. You have to conform. I mean, am I getting it a little bit right?
Yeah, I mean, there's this whole push for assimilation there that's exactly why Hong Kong is having issues, because they're worried that they're going to try to suppress culture and like individual culture, language, education. And so the Uyghur thing is a really interesting case study in that, because if you look into like the marriages that are happening there and just basically the cultural repression, it's kind of why I think we're seeing a lot more attention being given to it, even if it's long overdue. But with Mike Pompeo coming out recently and putting visa sanctions on China for the treatment of the Uyghur Muslims, yeah, it's a pretty big deal.
Right. But but a lot of people just don't know that's made a little bit of noise, but the Hong Kong thing has made much, much more. And specifically, this came up in like the NBA piece where one of the general managers tweeted out, again, support for Hong Kong. And then I don't know exactly why, if the higher-ups in the NBA made everybody walk it back. And there was nothing worse than watching Steve Kerr. That Steve Kerr is a legend, having to walk back ridiculous statements saying, well, he's not really sure, there's both sides. And I thought, you're allowed to say what you wish. I mean, what did you think? Did you see that Steve Kerr thing?
Oh my God. Yeah, that was a whole mess. Honestly, like that was happening like right when I was coming back on my last trip. And I was so happy that happened. Like that whole thing ended up happening because it finally got a lot of people to pay attention. And you have this inherent cultural clash between, towing the line with the CCP and then American free speech. And when you mess with America's free speech, like I didn't watch what Steve Kerr had, like his entire thing, but I think when you have an American, if you expect an American just to stand up for American values, and compromising that is going to piss off a lot of Americans. So yeah, I think it's put the NBA in a pretty precarious situation where any NBA players who are still trying to conserve, save face basically with China for those sweet dollars are going to, now you see just like all of the people outside of the games handing out the free Hong Kong t-shirts. And when they start actually like disrupting the games with the Hong Kong stuff, what do you expect? It's like the Streisand effect.
Yeah, it's funny because they came back and then said, well, the NBA is, we're apolitical, we're a basketball organization, but it seemed weird that they were allowing, American players to exercise their free speech with Black Lives Matter, so on and so forth, which is very controversial. And
Yeah.
that didn't seem to register for them. So it starts to get people a bit cynical and saying, all right, that there's a cultural bias that the NBA has. And, it's funny how they would let one go, which, both are controversial, let's be fair. And one's okay and the other isn't.
Yeah, it's a total hypocrisy. And yeah, I don't know. I think that was like almost comically done. It's and I can't wait. It's only the preseason, right? So I can't wait to see what actually happens when everyone starts watching and tuning in more.
Yeah. And LeBron kind of like switched his position back and said, well, I'm going to just shut up and dribble. This isn't helping my team win. I have
God.
Chinese. And then what was great was Shaq comes out and just says, hey, America is free speech. And you know what? I like the Chinese and, we like playing in China. But you know what? If you can't deal with the free speech, too bad. And that is that they should have just done that right at the beginning. Like, all right, yeah, this may be upsetting, but too bad. This is part of our culture. And when you have a cultural exchange, you're gonna need both. So I was really impressed with Shaq.
Right. It's interesting because the NBA obviously exists as an entity, but it's full of a bunch of individual players. Individual players can have certain feelings, but at the end of the day, the NBA's goal is to make money. So that definitely explains that it's the Chinese audience, the Chinese market itself is why a lot of these companies are so hesitant to say anything. Because the last thing you want is for you and your company to come out against it, and then for no one else to come with you,
or to lose
someone just scoops you on the
a
whole
big hunk
market.
of your customer base.
Right. I guess everyone's got their price, and now we're finding out exactly what some of these NBA prices are.
Right.
You know what seems to me though that with the NBA, like China, if China's not going to like cover their games, right? That they're going to lose advertising. They're going to that hurts the NBA, but it also hurts China. What are they going to do? Show their a lower form of basketball? One of the reasons why the Chinese government can still stay in power is generally Chinese citizens are okay with that government. They do a good job of actually making sure that the people are at least reasonably happy. And taking away their basketball for no good reason seems to not serve even the dictatorial Chinese government purposes. It seemed like, all right, why would they just let it go? Then if they want to censor the games, I'm sure they could create a department of censorship. I don't know why they didn't do that, but I guess it's easier if the NBA will just cave, which, that's what's upsetting. Then, so maybe you're going to lose an American audience.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, if they lose their NBA, they're going to have to start looking into VPNs, and I think the Chinese government is not going to want that because they'll see a lot more than NBA if they start using VPNs to get around firewalls.
Yeah. Now, I've seen in some of the pictures that you've taken, the umbrellas are there. Is that an homage to the umbrella protest, or are they just using these umbrellas? They almost as shields because they're getting sprayed at.
Oh, well, it's multifaceted. I mean, I'm sure I'm not exactly why they even started using them in the umbrella movement, to be honest, but it's extremely helpful in the rainy season, especially, which was the summer, and being able to protest even when it's like torrential downpours. And also, it does act as sort of a makeshift shield. It also helps with privacy. Instead of the typical Antifa tactic of taking or smashing a camera, they'll just put a umbrella up, so you can't see what they're doing, you can't see their faces. It's extremely effective, and all the while you don't harbor the hatred of journalists for breaking their shit. So it's very smart.
Well, it seems like that one of the problems for the Chinese police is trying to figure out who's a protester and who isn't, because you can kind of blend in with the citizenry. So one of the tactics they were doing, and I think the banks use this tactic against thieves, is having the blue bomb. So they give you the money, then it explodes, and now you're painted with this dye. So now they can, if they see the blue guy, then that's probably him. And they're doing the same thing to the protesters to try to mark them.
Yep, they put this blue dye in the water cannons, and it's actually, so I'm not sure at what point they started putting more than blue dye, but I believe they also, I think it's a form of tear gas. It's some kind of capsaicinoid that they'll also put in the water. But yeah, the dye is supposed to be able to mark people so they can arrest them later. And the capsaicinoid that they put in basically is an extra deterrent. It sets your skin on fire, basically, and it's like a really slow burn. And I learned this the hard way, unfortunately.
Did you get sprayed?
Completely doused, head to toe in blue dye, and to the point where it's still on my helmet that I bring everywhere when I'm covering protests and riots and stuff. But it was one of those things where it's like, oh, damn, okay, I got sprayed. It's like, no big deal, whatever. I've got my press vest. They know I'm not a protester, so I'll just, walk it off, whatever. And then about 5 minutes later, I was like, okay, this burns a lot more than a regular water cannon. And then 5 minutes after that, I was like, holy crap, this really, really hurts. And then it was just a gradual increase. And it got to the point where it was probably the most intense pain I've ever experienced in my life. Because, again, I cover head to toe. I'm sweating, so my pores are open. And it's just, oh, God, it hurts even thinking about it. But
so was it your face especially? Was your face covered?
I did have a gas mask on, so yes, my gas mask was covered in blue dye. So my mouth and everything was fine. My eyes were fine. It was just all of my skin, basically. And so the only way to get it off that I found was with dish soap. And so I didn't have any dish soap on me, believe it or not, when I was at the protest. So I was basically walking around with the stuff on me, and then there were these first aiders, the medics, street medics, who saw how covered I was, and they were like, oh my God. So they were like 6 of them trying to help me get it off, just like spraying saline up my arms and legs. And it wasn't doing much. It was just kind of getting the blue dye off. And it got to the point where I was just in so much pain, I was shaking. And then I realized about an hour later, I was close to my Airbnb. So I was like, all right, I have to do something. Like, I was so distracted just by the pain that I was worried I was going to put myself in danger, not being able to focus on like everything else that was happening. So that was one of those things where it was just, it lasted at least another day, because it wasn't, even when I washed it off with the dish soap, I still had just remnants of it in my skin. And my hands and my feet especially burnt for the next day, which was wild. It was, man, I feel for any of the protesters who get hit by that, honestly.
That's crazy. It's almost like a form of chemical warfare in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah, seriously.
I know, something else, I mean, you probably speak to this yourself, but something else that I thought was interesting was that the blue dye is especially bad for these protesters, because not only does it kind of brand you as a rioter, as the Chinese government sees it, and marks you for arrest, but I think the arrest sentences for rioting, I think in China, are like a 10-year minimum sentence or something like that.
Yeah, that's right. And that was another one of the demands, was that the charge for rioting be dropped for the protesters, because not everyone who was protesting was rioting. I mean, there's sort of a difference between a protest and a riot.
Right.
And basically, in order to in order to protest in Hong Kong, you have to get a letter of no objection for the protest to be legal. And so basically what ended up happening was they stopped issuing those letters of no objection to kind of stop the protests. And well, if people are going to protest anyway. So anyone who would get arrested after that would be charged with rioting because it wasn't a legal protest. So It's extremely unfair for the people who were peacefully protesting to be charged with rioting and face a 10-year sentence rather than, just being charged with the protest. But you shouldn't even be charged for protesting, in my opinion.
Right, which all makes the extradition bill that much more important to get struck down, or whatever the verbiage is that needs to be done. I forget what the exact wording is, that shelving perhaps, but no. Yeah,
they withdrew that, thankfully, but they want the charges to be arrested and amnesty for those who were basically those who were arrested.
So, like, this extradition bill, that sounds new. So is this if, like, a Hong Konger, like, does something, like, I don't know, physically, like, hurts or would murder a Chinese citizen or policeman? And that, like, who has the jurisdiction on this? Like, would you go to jail in Hong Kong, or do you extradite to China?
Yeah, the idea is they want to extradite them to the mainland. So the specific case they were trying to push it through for was a Taiwanese citizen who murdered someone in China. But I believe
that happened in China, not in Taiwan.
Hong Kong.
Okay, that happened in Hong Kong.
No, I think it happened. I believe it happened in China, and then he went back to Taiwan.
Okay.
I might not be 100% right on that, but the idea was that they wanted to bring him from Taiwan into mainland China. And actually, no, it was, hang on. I want to look this up, but I'm afraid I'm going to cut out. So, basically, they want to be able to bring someone from one region to another region. And the wording apparently was vague, so they were worried it was going to be abused. And it kind of sparked this whole thing. The interesting thing is the person who it was intended for, the person who was in Taiwan, turned themselves in because they didn't realize it was going to spark this whole thing. And this was actually within the last week as well. The man turned himself in, and he apologized for causing so much, I guess, chaos at this point. But yeah, I mean, the whole thing still stands. They withdrew the bill, though, so that was kind of a small victory for them. However, it's more than just one demand at this point.
Okay. Speaking of like being like in Hong Kong and in France, like there's a question in the chat asking if Subverse is going to go multilingual. That, and they're saying that there's a need for no spin and other places that don't speak English. And I wondered if you know anything about that.
Actually, we've been talking about it for multiple languages. We would like to. Obviously, that's a lot of extra work. We have a lot of people in different countries who want to get involved with what we're doing, which is awesome. So yes, eventually we would like to be multilingual. We would like to be able to put the work that we do in other countries and make it available for those people in those countries to watch. I mean, in the last week, I've been in France and in Spain. I don't speak either of those languages fluently. Thankfully, here in France, we have this great fixer. His name's Elliot. He was out with us yesterday. He was actually live streaming for us, and he was also helping do translations for our interviews, and he shot some amazing footage as well. So the more we get other people in other countries who want to get involved, the more that we can kind of speed up that whole process of getting it available in other languages in other countries.
Okay, good.
I guess kind of in that same sort of global sense, there's something that I didn't read the whole article, but someone was kind of quoted saying that just so there was an Arab Spring before, there seems to be a trend of a lot of riots creeping up across the world in Hong Kong, in France, in America, in Mexico border. Someone's kind of coining it as like the global spring in a way. Do you see, I guess, being out in the world more and more, do you see any tying connections between all these protests? Are they all more individual?
Well, I do think there are some overarching themes. I mean, if you look at what's happening in Lebanon, they've been in a deep recession from corrupt government. They've tried increasing taxes on normal people for things like internet calls, like calls you make through WhatsApp. And that just was like the straw that broke the camel's back for a lot of people. And we actually have a video on that coming out tomorrow. We actually have somebody who's in Beirut filming the protests and conducting interviews. But I think we have to treat all of these as these are individual nations with their individual problems, with, I'd say, overarching trends, a lot of them. But yeah, I think I think for a lot of this, because of how social media has changed things, we're seeing it more now. Obviously, we're seeing what's happening in Chile as well. And it's funny because at a lot of these protests, you see solidarity with the other movements in these other countries. Like in the Yellow Vest protest yesterday, there was like a whole part of support for Chile. And in Hong Kong, you're seeing a lot of support for the Catalan independence protests. So I think a lot of people will see these as mutual struggles, but I think each one has very individual reasons. I think for the most part, though, a lot of it is against their governments, and for, whatever reason, it's whether it's taxing or suppression or, people want more freedom or anything. There are definitely some similar themes, but different catalysts.
Yeah. Now, it seems like with the Hong Kong, with the specter of like China and like getting thrown in a Chinese prison, like seems to ramp up the angst more. But yet I've seen some of the Yellow Vest protests get some. It looks like a war zone at times too. Like, how are you feeling on the ground when you cover these?
Yeah, that's a good question, because they all have their different, similar but different atmospheres. Like the Hong Kong ones, you definitely feel the angst. Like, it's a lot of young people in Hong Kong who are the frontliners, who are doing the most of the action. And you could say that for most protests. Usually the people who are the most aggressive, or, I don't want to say aggressive, but, the ones who partake the most in the action are usually the younger people. In Hong Kong, that is especially the case. You have people as young as 9. I saw a lot of 14-year-olds even getting involved, and 14, 15, 16. We're talking about high school age kids who are doing a lot of the frontline protesting and rioting. But in Yellow Vests in particular are all ages, and the video we're putting out, I believe on Tuesday, you'll see that it's people from all ages, from sort of all over. It's like one of those where it's not left or right. It's like, it's just normal, average citizen for the most part. In Catalonia, it's kind of the same thing. You have a lot of the younger people taking part in the most action, but it's people from young to old, all walks, just sort of, protesting for what they believe in. So I would say the atmosphere is different depending on the level of action. But for the most part, the protests themselves do feel very similar, just with how unified they are.
What is the Catalonia? Is that the Basque provinces in Spain? Or what?
So it's like the northeast sort of, where Barcelona is. Yeah, it's kind of like that whole triangle that goes up to the border of France and everything. But so like Barcelona, Tarragona, Girona, there's a couple other major cities that are seeing the most action from those protests. But yeah, that's been an interesting one.
What's going on there?
So it's sort of been an ongoing, and this is a pretty complicated subject, and I wish I had more time and I wish I had a translator too, because that was one of the hardest ones to get somebody who spoke decent English to do interviews. It's been sort of an ongoing thing for years now that there's a big independence push in the Catalan region. And they've held some referendums on it before. There was an illegal referendum that was held in October 2017, that the police cracked down on. There was a lot of police brutality on that one. And so it kind of made the situation worse. A bunch of the pro-independence political party leaders were recently sentenced for sedition and public misuse of funds. So the reason it kicked off again recently was because those leaders were sentenced to prison. I think the lowest term was 9 years and the highest term was 13 years. So they collectively altogether had 100 years, and they're barred from holding office for the next 12 years. So yeah, I mean, it's a lot more political, but there's also, I think people will over politicize it. There's kind of there's also a really interesting cultural aspect to it, where some people just don't really care about the political aspect of it. They care about the self-determination aspect of it, where they want to be the ones to decide. And I don't think they care too much about whether it's done with politicians or by the people. They just want to be able to vote on that situation. So it's pretty divisive as a topic that I've noticed, at least when I was there. There was, it was extremely divisive for some people because, I don't know, I guess it's a very big identity issue. But that's one that we want to keep watching because it's very complicated, and I think it's going to keep going, especially now that they've sentenced those leaders to prison.
Right. Yeah, it's certainly interesting seeing more and more kind of, not revolutions, maybe
I guess I've been calling them
movements.
social movements because it's basically at the heart of it. That's what they are.
Sure. But more and more of these arising over in Europe. In particular, I think somewhere you're working in the near future too is going to be over in like kind of what's happening with Brexit still. You know, here we are 5 years later or whatever. Are you kind of looking to, I guess I haven't seen much about it in like how the people are reacting to it. Are you looking to go there and maybe get a reprieve from these big protests, or are you expecting to catch it right as the
I
powder
really don't
keg
know what
blows
to
up?
expect from the Brexit stuff, honestly. This is one where people have asked us over and over and over to cover Brexit. And there's really so much you can do from the U.S. where all you can really do is like read the news,
Right.
Listen to what the politicians are saying. There's probably going to be some protests, which I just kind of want to, as much as possible, hear what people have to say. And we're going to be talking to people who are, you know, the average citizen, and then we're going to be talking to people who are more politically engaged, and kind of figure out where everyone stands on those issues. So this is one where we're going into it with, we do have a plan, and we're going to cover a lot of other things while we're there. We actually just got credentialed for the Battle of Ideas that's happening November 2nd and 3rd,
Cool.
which I believe we can find also some people who are going to be talking about Brexit there. But I think, this is one where our audience is like, somebody needs to do a non-biased take on Brexit. It's so hard to find. So, yeah, I mean, we're just going to let people tell us what they think about it because we really have no skin in the game on this one.
Right. No, it's definitely hard, I guess, as an American myself, trying to figure out what's going on because, one, Parliament is just such a foreign constructed government system to me that I feel like, oh, there's like the lower house, the upper house, and then the prime minister. And I really have no idea how they all interplay to each other, but then I see all these, like, scandals. I'm like, oh, it's all very, I don't know, very surface level to me because I don't really understand kind of deep down what's actually happening to cause these sort of changes, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a totally different system to what we're used to. I mean, the fact that they still have a House of Lords is something I have a hard time wrapping my mind around.
And I think with Brexit it's kind of shocking that you would let something of such import come down to a straight vote. Because, you know, if this happens 70-30, then it's like, okay, well, I guess that's fine. But if it's 52-48, you know, and there's so much on the line, I think then you create strife. And it's...
Oh, yeah. And I mean, especially when you look at now knowing what we know about Cambridge Analytica and the Brexit campaigns that were constructed from that data. That, oh, my God, it's really crazy to think how much hinges on that one vote. Yeah. So it's going to be interesting to see how it unfolds for sure.
Yeah, that's. It seems like a lot of the people the Brexiteers, some Brexiteers and some non-Brexiteers think I can get agreement on that probably shouldn't have been put up for a vote. You know, straight up that there's a way to do it because I've known some people that were Remainers that are like, but we have to do it or else democracy means nothing. Right. I mean, even if you're a Remainer and you say, well, let's do a revote, then I mean, you're really undermining the democratic process. So it's tough.
Yeah, I mean, it's also interesting when you look at what's happening here in France, where the Yellow Vests want a citizen-initiated referendum, and then you see a lot of people in the UK who aren't happy with those kinds of referendums. I don't know if it's just figuring out the best system to address those kinds of larger social issues that basically go to the very top levels of the government and the future of the countries.
Mm-hmm.
I know you brought up Cambridge Analytica, which is kind of something that's very near and dear to my heart. But it's like Ryan and I have talked about before. Being in journalism and kind of interacting with social media, do you see? I guess my argument is that the prevalence of a company's ability to reach such a wide audience and such a specific targeted audience has done something very unreversibly bad for democracy. And I think that it's interesting to see all these pro-democratic movements popping up in sight of this. Like, I don't see. It seems that people aren't really seeing this for the big issue that it is, and instead relying on these going forward. I don't know. This is not really much of a question, but
yeah, no, I think the whole Cambridge Analytica thing is pretty wild to me, and just I don't know. I've got a lot of things to say about just Facebook and data manipulation in general, and just how unprepared I still think we are for massive data manipulation. But I guess we're seeing some strides come through with Twitter and Facebook and Google, kind of figuring out what massive manipulation looks like and trying to keep any kind of disasters from happening on their watch again.
So are you optimistic that they're going to be able to stop something from happening again?
I don't know, though, because that's the thing. Like, I feel like a lot of the ways that they're trying to fix it are reactive to the problems rather than proactive. So again, I don't know a whole lot about like data science. I could be wrong. Maybe they are doing stuff that's more proactive. But from what I've seen, like especially over the mass coordinated I don't want to call them attacks, mass coordinated efforts on behalf of, or the Chinese mass coordinated behavior on Hong Kong, which is what Twitter, Facebook, and Google reacted to. They said, we saw this strange activity coming from these IPs that were hidden through VPNs, so we knew to take it down. And we've banned those accounts. So that's reactive. I don't know what they're doing to prevent that kind of stuff in the future. I don't know if they can, honestly.
It's interesting. Yeah, well, another question from that chat came from like European governments trying to go to like a cashless system. I think what they're saying is that getting rid of cash and everything is electronic. So I didn't know there was a move towards this. Are you seeing that at all?
So I've seen some things on smaller scales that are like that. Well, I guess one of the big things is in China, they kind of already have something like that where you have WeChat Pay, and there's some similar stuff in Hong Kong as well. And then I know Libra was basically trying to do that, where they're trying to have the digital payment system that can be independent of any other country's currencies. I think it would be, if you think about, I don't know, I mean, money, how it stands now, it is all pretty much digital, except for, the cash that you carry in your pocket and the faith that you can go to the ATM and pull out the cash that you want, assuming, it'll give you what you need. So I think it's the next, it makes sense that countries would want to do that. I don't know a whole lot about it, though, to be honest.
Yeah. I mean, the governments can manipulate your currency, right? So you could print a bunch of money. You can inflate and deflate your currency. So it seems of some value to have a blockchain or currency that isn't dependent on a government.
I know to me, it seems riskier to have a currency completely detached from any sort of fiduciary system. Like governments are able to enact fiscal policy, monetary policy to influence kind of inflation rates and the money supply and kind of the price of goods. I see the pros from having an anonymous currency, a detached from corrupt bureaucratic systems currency, but at the same time, like if it runs out of control, then it runs out of control. There's no way to stop it.
I'm not saying to get rid of that, but to have that in addition. So you would have you could have this currency running around like a Libra or something, or or a Bitcoin or whatever that's detached from government. But it's not like all governments are just going to give up their own currencies. What I'm saying is having both seems like you would have a hedge. It's the diversity model.
Yeah, but I don't know if you guys we did a video on Thursday about the hearings that Mark Zuckerberg had over Libra with U.S. Congress, and it's actually interesting if you think about the consequences of the economic power that the U.S. dollar has on other countries versus they're worried basically that something like Libra would undermine the value of the U.S. dollar, and then they wouldn't be able to wield around sanctions or be able to catch tax evaders or, track money that helps them find drug dealers and human traffickers. And sure. So it's interesting because they're really playing that angle. And I think they are worried of something being independent from the U.S. dollar because of how powerful it can be.
Right.
Yeah. No, that's a good counter argument. I agree.
There's definitely the U.S. kind of not wanting to lose their position as the dominant currency. But I also, maybe I'm being optimistic and naive, but I know I saw the part of the hearing, Mark Zuckerberg was saying that Facebook can't do this alone. And it seems like they're trying to kind of get all these other big internet companies together to help create Libra, this currency, which, if it were to take some of the power away from the U.S. dollar, would cause this cartel of internet companies to have like fiscal control over the world, which seems terrible. I mean, I'd rather have the government, and with its known corruption and bureaucracy, have control over the system than all these kind of faceless corporations.
Well, yeah, exactly. At least the average person can elect someone who has a little more control over that rather than a cabal of, I don't mean to call it a cabal, but a group of giant rich corporations that already have more money than they could ever want. So what more do you want after tons of money? You want more power. So I don't know. It just seems like there's a lot that could go wrong. And I get that they have a committee and everything that's supposed to have accountability and everything. But again, it's like all of these companies are wealthy and rich and, they're private companies, so they can get away with a lot more than the U.S. government can, is because the U.S. government has regulations that can be put on. Yeah, I don't know. I think it's going to be a tricky territory going forward, because obviously there's a lot of people who are going the way of crypto. There's a lot of people who I know think investing in crypto is more secure than investing in a 401k, which, if you look at the history of our financial recessions and everything, it's not the worst idea when you put it into perspective. But yeah, it's just kind of showing that the US dollar is losing sort of the strength that it used to have.
Yeah. No, but yeah, I think it's a good point. Governments would want to have control, and it's so much that you feel like your government is mostly doing the right thing. I can see why you would be anti-blockchain. Yeah, it's interesting. It's good concern. Well, yeah, are you gonna?
I'm not necessarily anti-blockchain either myself. I think there's a place for that. I think two systems could go well hand in hand as long as neither one or the other has too much power.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point.
Like Hong Kong and China.
Yeah.
So Full circle.
What's next? How long are you in France, and what do you plan on getting in next?
So unfortunately, leaving Paris tomorrow, heading to London. I'm going to be in London until early November, then heading home because I've been gone for a while, and not for long though, because I'm going to come back to Paris for the 1-year anniversary of the Yellow Vest movement, which I think is going to be a pretty big deal because it's been a year. They've been consistently protesting, and I think they're expecting a lot more people to sort of join in on this one. And then after the year of the Yellow Vest, I would really love to go back to Hong Kong because they've got their elections coming up and they're trying to get the Hong Kong people want more pro-democracy politicians. So we'll see if that happens. I think there's a lot to consider. But yeah, there's so much going on in the world right now. It's hard to figure out where to go.
It'll be interesting next year or so for sure.
Yeah. And I like how you guys would kind of go in blind. I remember you said one time to us that the best way to get rid of biased reporting is to send reporters into places where you don't know what's going on, so you have no preconceived notion. So it's cool, like you kind of.
It depends on the situation, but yeah, when it's a domestic issue, like something like sending somebody who doesn't know a politician in to cover their the politician. It can keep some of the bias from happening. But in these situations, you don't necessarily want to put somebody who has no knowledge of protester riots into a protester riot situation.
Like Alice in Wonderland.
Yeah, good point. Well, Emily, it's great talking with you. It's
always a pleasure.
We love what you're doing. You are a jet setter like crazy. So safe travels, and I hope you get back soon. You can take a rest.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
All right. Take care. Thanks.
You too. All right. Good stuff.
Yeah. Thanks so much. We really appreciate you giving us so much time. And